Yeah, so tonight I watched Piranha, the 1978 film directed by Joe Dante. This is one of those films that, even though it's quite famous, I never really got around to watching it. It just didn't really inspire me for some reason. Jaws is amazing, but generally I don't find water based horror very interesting or scary, and maybe that's because I don't go in the water much. This is set in a river, and I don't live in the river. So, well, either way, uh, this was made by Joe Dante. Like I said, came out in 1978. There's lots of films I like from that period, and I love old horror. So, I was on a streaming site. There it was. I clicked on it, and Joe Dante, of course, he made a lot of good films. He made, I checked, he made Inner Space, The Howling, Gremlins, and Gremlins 2, which I love. There's great stories about how Gremlins 2 came about. Apparently, he was persuaded by the studio to make it. He didn't want to make it, he was persuaded to make it with the promise of complete creative control. So he made it as crazy and as goofy as he could. So that's a great story behind that one. I love that. Actually, I'm one of those people that thinks Gremlins 2 is at least as good as Gremlins. I think he's a very talented director, but Piranha's a pretty early effort. Um, I don't think he was quite there yet with this one, but yeah, I thought it was a pretty good film. So this is a bit of a stupid question, but well, what is Piranha about? Well, the film starts when some teenagers find an abandoned compound. It's like a research compound, and they decide to go skinny dipping in this holding pool. Basically, the water there looks like shit, and it's quite funny because the guy he says this looks like shit, but his girlfriend just shoves him in and says, "Well, in you go," which is a bit weird. You would have thought she would say, "Yeah, it looks like shit. Maybe we should go somewhere else." I don't know why they would want to go skinny dipping in that. Just looking at the water, it looked crap, but that was quite funny. The whole film has a weird comedic vibe that's a little bit jarring sometimes, almost like they were trying to make a comedy but they failed. But at the same time, at other points, it comes across like a serious horror film. It's got a lot of the hallmarks of a film that's trying to be a horror film, but then some very comedic things happen later on. Some things happen which seem to be aiming at straight up comedy. So I think it's a horror comedy, but when I looked on Wikipedia, it just said a horror film. So I laughed a few times. It's very entertaining. So yeah, it's worth watching for the comedy as well as the horror. So anyway, these two they basically get eaten, predictably enough. That's the setup. They've been eaten. Um, they're I think they're dead. And this detective, she's like a private investigator, what's called a skip tracer. I learned that word today reading about this film. Person who goes to find the whereabouts of missing people. It's called a skip tracer, apparently. So this detective, Skip, she's not a detective really, she's a skip tracer, a woman called Maggie, gets sent to find missing teenagers near a lake called Lost River Lake. When she gets there, she hires this drunk guy, Paul, who's sort of a lonely drunk man living in a cabin or something in the area, to be her guide. He just drinks all the time, and they go together to check out this compound and this holding pool where these teenagers got eaten. So I assume it was those teenagers they were hired to go looking for. I wasn't quite sure about that. But they go to this compound, and there's this building, like a lab attached to it, and it's full of all these experimental creatures in jars and stuff. There's actually one thing that's still alive in there. It's like this stop motion creature, and it's a bit odd because it appears and it's sort of lurking around the lab, and then it just never appears in the film again. So I assume maybe they just wanted to show some stop motion effect. It looks like a bit like a rat gremlin thing. It's a bit looks a little bit like one of the Sumatran rat monkey from the beginning of Peter Jackson's Brain Dead, also known as Dead Alive. It is kind of shaky stop motion, so I can see why they didn't use it much. In fact, you don't really see many piranhas in this film either, but that's another story. So anyway, basically they decide that they want to drain the pool. to presumably to see if there's any bodies in there, and they find a skeleton in there. So it's all very creepy. But later on, this comes into play later on, we find out in the act of draining this pool, they've basically released all the experimental piranhas that were in there into the local waterways with dire consequences. So yeah, it turns out that this was research done by the government later on to make some super piranhas in this holding pool. So anyway, that's sort of skipping forward a bit. But while they're there, they get attacked by this weird guy. After that, that's sort of lurking around. He comes sort of out of nowhere and he attacks them, and they beat him up and knock him out. And then later on, he steals their jeep, and he totals that, or he smashes that up, and they end up taking him back to Paul the drunk's place and looking after him, and now they're all a team. So now there's three of them. There's Paul the drunk, there's Maggie the skip tracer, and there's this random guy that attacked them, and they beat him up. And it turns out that the guy isn't really a random guy. He's a doctor called Dr. Hoke. And he was the lead scientist in some project to make these ultra super piranhas that could survive in salt water and cold water, and the plan was to release them into Vietnamese rivers to piss off the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. But the war ended and the project got cancelled. It was called Project Razor Teeth, for somewhat obvious reasons. That project got cancelled, and anyway, so that's why the piranhas exist. That's why they're in the holding pool that the two teenagers went skinny dipping in at the beginning of the film before they got eaten. So you got these super piranhas, and Maggie's accidentally released them into local ecosystem. And then I think, now I'm not too clear on this because I don't know if I zoned out or if the film was sort of kind of smashed together a little bit, or the exposition wasn't too great or something like that. It might be my fault. But I got a bit bored here and there. I zoned out a bit here and there, but from what I can gather, there was a dam that was due to be open, and if the dam got open, it would release all of the piranhas that Maggie had let out into the river, and they would just go everywhere, all around the world. So they have to stop that from happening. But then Dr. Hoke, the guy that attacked them earlier, the research guy, he gets killed by the mutant fish. And Paul rushes across and he stops the dam getting open, and then they call the military, and Paul and Maggie get put in a prison cell, stop them telling everyone what's happened, stop the media from finding out, but they escape because they bash one of the guards unconscious with a bit of toilet cistern. So it's sort of a chaotic film with people running around and so on. There's not too much emphasis for the first hour, I think, on actual piranha attacks. And it seems like they didn't really know how to show them, which is one of my problems with the film. I don't want to be too harsh on it because it feels like they didn't have a huge budget. It feels like it was a director's early effort, but it's probably quite hard really to show a realistic piranha attack. So what they did was they had the camera swishing around a lot. They had sort of black objects in the water, blood bubbling up, showing a lot of red, and there would be this noise which indicated piranha attack. It was the I don't know what the word is, like the auditory language or something for piranha attack happening. I can't really do the sound, but it was a strange sound that I don't think piranhas would make that sound. It was like going woo 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 or something like that. But the piranhas, they would show the piranhas sort of nipping at people, and it would make this noise, and the camera swished around. And I understand they might not have had, didn't have CGI back then, and they didn't have convincing practical effects, so they had to make do with what they had. But this happens over and over throughout the film, and in the end you just get frustrated because you want to see a real piranha attack. You want to see like piranhas stuck on people and ripping their flesh out because it's a horror film, or piranhas actually moving through the water. Things like that. And unlike Jaws, it doesn't really build too much tension around the attacks that are happening in the water. Jaws was very good at showing you the shark's shadow lurking around and build ups to the attacks, whereas this, they happen very suddenly. But so the actual piranha attacks weren't too great. They happened mostly at the end of the film. They weren't too great. But the after effects, when they showed people's faces all chewed up, some of those practical effects are actually, they were a bit cheesy, but they were enjoyable. They look quite good. So anyway, Paul and Maggie escape from the prison cell, and now I'm a bit muddled. There's a lot of hectic stuff happening towards the end, but it seems that the piranha are sort of eating everyone at the resort. There's a resort, and Paul and Maggie cook up a plan to take them out with industrial waste. They're going to release some industrial waste, and the control room that releases the chemicals is underwater. So Paul has to hold his breath to the count of 100. This is the longest he can hold his breath. She has to count to 100, and if he's not back up to the surface, she leaves. He has to go underwater to do this, and he goes down there and he releases the waste, and he gets bitten to smithereens, and he's a hero. And then he goes into some sort of catatonic state, and then a lady scientist goes on TV and I think she was on TV. Anyway, she says that there's nothing to worry about. There's no piranhas around, and then the film ends with a lingering shot, the ocean turning red, implying that perhaps the piranhas did in fact get out into the broader ocean and have become a global threat. So that's the plot, really. And it's decent. It's decent if you like campy horror. If you want to watch something that you can just kind of zone out, great. Slap it on. It's only 90 minutes as well, which is great. As with so many films these days being 2 hours, 2.5 hours, I really appreciate a 90-minute film. It's an easy watch. It's definitely not a masterpiece. It's nowhere near as good as Jaws. It's not as good as Gremlins, but it's a good time killer. It's a one-time watch for me. I don't think I would watch it again. I'll give my score again later, but I kind of was thinking 5.5 to 6, somewhere around there, which is in line with what it's got on IMDb at the moment. There's a lot of camp value to it. The film was pretty close to Jaws in what it was trying to do, and it was so much so that Universal Studios threatened to sue or get an injunction to prevent distribution of the film, because apparently Jaws 2 was due out around the same time and they didn't want to compete with it. But then Steven Spielberg saw Piranha and said that he loved it, and the matter was dropped, and the film came out without any legal obstacles. I don't know how well it did. I have to look up how much it took, but I think there was a sequel, so must have done quite well. So yeah, I don't really entirely share Steven Spielberg's enthusiasm for this. I think that maybe it's aged. I don't know. I'm giving mixed messages about this. I think it's worth a watch. I think it's enjoyable, but at the same time, it has aged a bit poorly. It's not bad. There's entertaining parts, but like I said, it doesn't really establish the stakes too clearly. It doesn't say, here is some piranha, here's a family, for example, that you really care about with children, and they're going to swim in this lake and they might get bitten, and then have establishing shots of piranha getting closer and closer and a good score and things like that, like Jaws might have done. It's the people that get eaten as sort of randos that you don't really have much attachment to, and it sort of rattles along like that from scene to scene. A prison escape scene, water skiing scene, but there isn't too much connective tissue tying it all together in terms of characters that you care about. The main characters, Paul and Maggie, they seem to rattle from situation to situation. They do get in danger themselves every now and again, but for some reason there's not too much tension there. Some of the most memorable parts of the comedy, or the parts that run intentionally or intentionally funny, there's one bit which I thought was hilarious, where for whatever reason that I'd forgotten, Maggie and Paul have to distract this military guy, and he's just sort of standing there, and they have a discussion about how they're going to distract him, and Paul says, you're a woman, you go over there, come on to him or something, distract him. And she says, what if he's gay? But she just says it immediately. She doesn't think for a minute and think what could be the problem with this plan. She just immediately goes, "What if he's gay?" And I thought, well, fair enough, that's quite funny. And then she goes up to the military guy, and she just says, "Are you gay?" to him, which was, again, that made it even funnier. And he's like, "What? What did you ask me?" And then she just lifts her top up, just goes topless in front of him. It's just such a strange um, sequence of pieces of behavior, really. And I think they must have written that to be funny on purpose, because it was funny, but it's also quite jarring in the context of a horror film. But it doesn't really matter. It's a campy horror film, so there's some goofy stuff in there. That's funny. Um, so basically, to sum up, I would say watch it for the camp value, watch it for the comedy. There's not really much horror in there that's going to scare you. But then again, not that many horror films are actually frightening. So really, when we say a horror film's frightening, we mean it's tense, or there was suspense, or it creeped us out or something. There isn't much suspense in here, and there isn't that much that's going to creep you out. It's not suspenseful in the sense that Jaws is suspenseful. It's not creepy in the sense that something like Hereditary or Get Out might be creepy. It's a campy monster film where you don't really see the monsters enough, and the attacks aren't that great, but it is funny, and it is short enough that it won't waste your entire evening. It won't take up your entire evening. And it's well directed enough, and it rattles along, and there's some decent set pieces, like I said, with a bit of water skiing and this underwater sequence where he's struggling to release chemicals while he's getting attacked by piranhas and stuff like that. So basically, it's not that cohesive like a Spielberg film would be. It feels like a lot of bits shoved together, but it's campy. It's reasonably funny. There's some memorable bits. It's a good one-time watch. So, yeah, I give it, between 5.5 and 6 out of 10. Yeah, check it out if you like that sort of thing. Thank you.